Picture this, it's 2008. The gaming industry is bleeding money. Major publishers are shutting down studios left and right. Budgets are spiraling out of control, reaching hundreds of millions of dollars for a single game. Publishers are terrified to take risks. Every new release needs to be the next Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto, or it's considered a failure. Then, a single programmer named Jonathan Blow releases a little puzzle platformer called Braid. Made by a tiny team, it costs less than most AAA games spend on catering, and it changes everything. This is the story of how indie games didn't just survive in the shadow of giant corporations. This is the story of how they saved an entire industry from itself. Today we're talking about one of the most important movements in gaming history, the indie game revolution. When people think about the games that define the last 15 years, they often think about massive blockbusters like The Last of Us or Red Dead Redemption. But the real heroes of modern gaming are the small teams, the solo developers, and the creative misfits who refuse to play by the rules. Indie games haven't just provided us with some of the most memorable gaming experiences of our lives. They've pushed the entire industry forward, forced innovation, and reminded everyone what games could be when creativity comes before profit. Today, we're going to explore how these scrappy underdogs became the saviors of an industry that was slowly killing itself. Let's go back to the mid-2000s. The gaming industry was facing what many called an existential crisis. Development costs were skyrocketing. Publishers became obsessed with guaranteed hits and safe formulas. Innovation was seen as too risky. The result? We got endless sequels, copy-paste shooters, and games that felt more like products than art. Studios were afraid to experiment. Publishers demanded that every game appeal to the broadest possible audience, which often meant appealing to no one in particular. Many talented developers felt trapped in this system. They had incredible ideas, but couldn't get funding unless their pitch sounded exactly like something that had already made millions. The industry was becoming creatively bankrupt. Then came the digital distribution revolution. Platforms like Steam, Xbox Live Arcade, and later mobile app stores created something that had never existed before, a direct line between developers and players. Suddenly, you didn't need a major publisher to get your game in front of millions of people. This opened the floodgates for indie development. Small teams could create games on shoestring budgets and release them to a global audience. The barriers to entry dropped dramatically. You didn't need $1 million marketing budget or relationships with retail stores. You just needed a good game and an internet connection. Let's talk about the games that started this revolution. Braid, released in 2008, showed that a small team could create something that rivaled AAA productions in terms of quality and impact. Jonathan Blow's time manipulation puzzler proved that indie games could be both commercially successful and artistically ambitious. World of Goo came out the same year, demonstrating how indie developers could create entirely new gameplay experiences. These weren't just smaller versions of AAA games. They were something completely different. But nothing prepared the industry for what came next. In 2009, a Swedish programmer named Marcus Persson started working on a little block-building game called Minecraft. What began as a simple creative tool eventually became the best-selling game of all time, surpassing every major AAA franchise. Minecraft proved that indie games weren't just a cute side market. They could dominate the entire industry. The success of these early pioneers triggered an indie renaissance that continues today. Suddenly, everyone wanted to make indie games. Digital storefronts were flooded with creative, weird, and wonderful experiences that would never have existed in the old system. Super Meat Boy showed that indie games could master tight, challenging gameplay that made AAA platformers look lazy. Limbo proved that indie games could create atmospheric experiences that rivaled Hollywood productions. Fez demonstrated how indie developers could play with game mechanics in ways that big studios never would. Each of these games did something that AAA games had stopped doing. They took risks. They weren't afraid to be weird, difficult, or niche. They trusted that there was an audience for creative, original experiences. Indie games also transform the relationship between developers and players. AAA studios are massive corporations with PR departments and carefully controlled messaging. Indie developers are often just regular people who talk directly to their communities. This created a level of connection that was impossible in the old system. Players could see the development process, offer feedback, and feel like they were part of the game's creation. Steam Early Access, Kickstarter campaigns, and developer streams made game development transparent and collaborative. Games like Stardew Valley emerged from this new model. Eric Barone spent 4 years creating his farming simulator, largely by himself, constantly engaging with the community and incorporating player feedback. When it launched, it felt like a game made specifically for its audience because, in many ways, it was. While AAA games focused on making bigger explosions and more realistic graphics, indie games asked deeper questions about what games could actually be. They explored themes that mainstream games wouldn't touch. That Dragon Cancer used the medium to explore grief and loss in ways that no other art form could. Gone Home turned environmental storytelling into the entire game. Journey created wordless emotional connections between strangers online. These games proved that games could be more than entertainment. They could be art, therapy, education, and social commentary. They expanded the very definition of what a game could be. The success of indie games didn't go unnoticed by major publishers. At first, many tried to dismiss the indie boom as a fad, but when games made by tiny teams started outselling major releases, the industry had to pay attention. Major publishers began copying indie aesthetics and mechanics. They started funding smaller projects. Some created indie publishing arms to work with smaller developers. The influence flowed both ways. Indie developers got better resources, and AAA games got more creative. We started seeing AAA games that borrowed heavily from indie sensibilities. Games like Inside, developed by the team behind Limbo, showed that indie developers could grow while maintaining their creative vision. Today, the line between indie and AAA is blurrier than ever. Some indie studios have grown into major developers. Some AAA studios have adopted indie approaches to development. The entire industry has been reshaped by the indie revolution. Digital storefronts now feature indie games alongside major releases. Game Awards shows regularly honor indie games. Players actively seek out indie experiences, knowing they will often be more creative and personal than mainstream alternatives. The indie movement has created a sustainable ecosystem for creative game development. Developers can build careers making the games they want to make, and players have access to a constant stream of fresh, innovative experiences. Let me get personal for a moment. I'll be honest, indie games completely changed my gaming habits. I used to be that guy who only bought the biggest releases, but then I played Papers, Please and found myself genuinely stressed about checking fake passports. I spent hours in Stardew Valley organizing my crops like it was the most important thing in the world. Hollow Knight made me feel like a total badass exploring underground caverns, even though I died approximately 1,000 times. The weird thing is that these games stuck with me way longer than most AAA blockbusters. I can barely remember the plot of the last Call of Duty I played, but I still think about the characters from Undertale. I've probably spent more time talking about indie games with friends than any major release. Indie games taught me that sometimes the best gaming experiences come from the weirdest places. The indie game revolution isn't just a feel-good story about small developers beating the odds. It's a fundamental shift in how we think about creativity, risk-taking, and what it means to make something meaningful. When the gaming industry was choking on its own ambitions, indie developers reminded everyone why we fell in love with games in the first place. They showed that you don't need $100 million budgets to create experiences that move people. You just need passion, creativity, and the courage to try something new. Indie games didn't just save the industry, they reminded it of its soul. And in a world that desperately needs more creativity, more authenticity, and more human connection, that might be the most important revolution of all. The The future of gaming isn't being written in corporate boardrooms or massive development studios. It's being written by passionate individuals who believe games can be more than products. They can be art, they can be connection, they can be hope. And that future looks brighter than ever.